Hey everyone, John from ID here, and I'm going to be just doing a quick talk through as I fly this rocket to the moon here. Hopefully this will just give you an idea of the process and something to reference as you're working on this. So what I've got here is a little moon goer here. You'll have access to download the ship design if you want to just use this to fly. I'd encourage you to try to design your own, but that can be a little time consuming, so if you want to, you can use this one. I've built it with way more than enough delta V to get to the moon and back, so landing on the moon with it should be relatively easy. So I'm just going to walk through each of the stages and their purposes before we get out there on the launch pad and see it in action. So, we start off with these 4 solid boosters. Those are basically just going to get us off the ground, provide us a lot of easy force. So we're basically going to be firing those until they run out of fuel, at which point we will go to our next stage, which will release those 4 boosters off the side and activate our main engine here. So this engine, the primary purpose will be to get us basically circular in our orbit around the Earth. So we'll use this to sort of finish circularizing our orbit, and this stage will probably end up having some fuel left over once we finish circularizing our orbit, so you can abandon it at that point if you'd like, because then the next stage is our more vacuum-suited engines here, which I'll pull off this so you can take a look at it. So this part of the rocket is going to be mainly what is going to be driving us to the moon and getting us into the orbit around the moon. So in this stage, you'll use this giant fuel tank to set up your moon orbit. Once you get into your moon orbit, this next stage will split off this lander here. So the lander will pull off here so we can take a look. From here. So this lander has a crew pod that can hold 1 Kerbal, and they can extend landing gear, which you'll use to land on the moon. And these little RCS thrusters will help you make small adjustments while you're up there, make it a little bit easier to keep upright, and also when you're returning to orbit to meet back up with your command module here, it'll make it a lot easier to finish that rendezvous. Cool. Alright, I'm going to undo these changes I got here. Get back to operational. I'll just load it again so that we can make sure we have everything as it should be. Alright, so what we're also going to do is we're going to be looking at our crew here. So we've got 1 crew, 1 pilot in our command pod here. We're just going to bring along another pilot just in case we need to pilot those 2 things separately. If we were playing in a science or career mode, you might want to bring along a scientist. I didn't include any science modules on this because this is built for sandbox. Alright, so now the fun part. Go to launch. Alright, so on the launch pad here, we're ready to go. I usually hit Z to just get that throttle max. If you haven't used throttle much before, you can hit X to cut all the throttle, Z to go up to the max. Control will lower it slightly. Shift will increase it slightly. Keeping the throttle at the max will mean that any rockets that you can actually adjust the thrust of will start firing as soon as their stage is on. The other thing I like to do before starting is hit this SAS. That's the stability control. You can also toggle it on and off by holding S. You can, and then leave T. T turns it on and off. But you can always just click this button here on the top right of the nav ball. The mode I like to keep it in as we start here is stability assist. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to try to keep the rocket pointing in the direction that it is currently pointing. This is going to be helpful because with it off, small forces, differences in aerodynamic stuff could knock you off course. So this is basically going to have the pilots try to keep it held for you. This is actually a feature you only get if you bring a pilot along. So if you forget to add crew or forget to bring a pilot, you won't be able to use the stability control things unless you add some probe parts to let you do it. So that's another important thing to remember. Bring along a Kerbal who is a pilot. All right, so now we're just about ready to launch. Our goal here is basically, I'm going to hit M to get out to the larger map. So we're launching from the Kerbal Space Center here. Our goal is going to be get into an equatorial orbit here, where we're going to go just be orbiting like this. And then once we have the orbit, we're going to extend our orbit to meet up with the moon. And then we are going to go from there. I'll talk through each of these as we do them. But basically our first goal is going to be to launch straight up, and then we are going to start going east that direction. So because the rocket is facing this direction, basically that'll be A and D on the WASD to start going left to right. So I'll go left with the D key as we launch, but yeah, we'll talk through it as we go. So I'm going to hit space to kick off that first stage, which is going to launch these 4 solid fuel boosters. So as we start to take off here, see we're getting some good speed, and as we start to get up, I will want to start slightly tilting to the east. As you go, you're also going to want to open up this maneuver mode. This is going to tell you what the apoapsis and periapsis of your current orbit are. So that's going to be, the apoapsis is the highest elevation you will reach with your current course. So right now, if we cut the engines right now, we'd only get up to 12 kilometers and the flight would be over. To get into an orbit, we want to be outside of the atmosphere, which ends around 70 kilometers above Kerbal. So we'll want this apoapsis to be at least above 70, and then we'll need to get the periapsis, which is the lowest point of your orbit, also above 70. We'll talk through how to do that as we go. So these solid boosters are going to give you more than enough to get that apoapsis high enough. As long as you're like mostly going just like slightly diagonal here, you're fine. You can even go straight up. It just saves a little bit of fuel if you go slightly diagonal here. So again, our apoapsis is way too high here. This is pretty inefficient, unfortunately, but it's fine because we have fuel to work with. So now that those solid fuel boosters have gone, I'm going to cut the throttle, and let's take a look at what our orbit looks like. So right now, we're kind of flying straight up. We're going to hit that apoapsis up there, and then we're going to come back down. So what we're going to want to do, so you can think of your orbit as basically this ellipse here, and currently that goes, underneath the planet, because you kind of run back into it. What we're going to want to do is basically make this ellipse a circle here. And the most efficient way to change the apoapsis or periapsis is going to be to apply force when you're at the top, or at the opposite point in the orbit, basically. So by applying force prograde at the apoapsis, you will create a more circular orbit, and that's going to use the least fuel to do that. You can still make those changes at other points, but it just will be a little bit more fuel efficient. Just to talk through how I'm doing that here, if you put your mouse anywhere along your route here, you can click, you can add maneuver nodes, and what these will do is they'll give you a little draggable, adjustable point that you can use to see what would happen if you would apply certain amounts of thrust. So this is basically creating a maneuver node, and by dragging this little prograde indicator here, I can change the amount of fuel I'm going to basically spend on this maneuver, and then it'll basically show you what the result of that maneuver will be. So right now, what we want is a maneuver where the periapsis is above where the atmosphere ends. So we're going to get to at least 70 there. So let's adjust this a little bit. And you could do this manually without a maneuver node, but the maneuver nodes make it nice, and it will also tell you where the maneuver is going to happen. So in here, our maneuver node will encounter it in 2 minutes and 49 seconds. It'll also tell you how long you'll have to fire the engines at that maneuver node to accomplish your maneuver. And the other really nice thing is now our stability assist has the option to go to the maneuver mode, And what that'll do is the pilots will keep the rocket pointed at the correct direction to make the maneuver that you've planned. So that's an easy way to just make sure your maneuvers go off relatively without a hitch. So basically, now that we've got this sort of planned orbit set up, I'll talk a little bit about how to perform a maneuver successfully. So, as you can see, the maneuver right here is basically applying 1394.8 meters per second of delta V. At that point, we can see we have enough fuel to do that. You can actually check in the stage here how much fuel that stage still has. So we still have 1,859 meters per second of delta V at this stage, so we've got enough to do this maneuver. The other thing that we're looking for is this burn time. So the maneuver node is calculated basically as if you applied all of that force right at that exact moment. But that's not how it works, because the rocket takes time to push for that long. So basically what you want to try to do is you want to try to line up the burn time to be just before the maneuver node, about halfway through, because that sort of will average out the force over the duration of your burn, and your maneuver will be as close to accurate as possible. So in this case, we're actually coming up on when we want to start to burn, because you got a 2-minute burn time, and we're 1 minute behind where the maneuver begins. So if we start burning at 1 minute left, we'll burn for a minute, we'll hit our maneuver node, then we'll burn for another minute, and the maneuver will be complete. So I'm going to hit the throttle, and we're going to start doing this maneuver. So now that we're burning, I'll open up the map. You can see that our orbit is starting to get more and more circular as we're burning prograde. So this isn't exactly prograde, but it's basically what prograde would be at our maneuver node, which is still coming up in a few seconds. You can see as you're burning on a maneuver, it will show you how much meters per second of delta V you still have left to apply. So you can kind of see how much more maneuver you have left to do. Once you've gotten to orbit a number of times, you can probably do this manually without too much trouble, but maneuver nodes are a good way to do it starting out, because it will keep you on track. One thing to note on my flight here, I got way higher here, partially to have more time to talk about it, but also because those solid fuel boosters we had are a little bit overkill for what we're doing here. But this will just basically, part of the goal of this design was to make sure that you could get to space pretty much no matter what. You could probably design something that does it with a lot less fuel than I've brought here. But yeah, just wait for another 36 seconds of burn time. As you can see, our periapsis is now only negative 250 kilometers, and you can sort of see our orbit starting to pop out over here. Dokie. And then because maneuvers are sort of approximate, they're never going to come out exactly right. Let me cut our thing. So I overshot it by about 20 meters per second there, but you can now see that our actual orbit is just about what the maneuver node had planned. I burned a little too long, so our periapsis is a little bit higher than we planned it, but that's okay, no problems there. Once you're done with the maneuver node, and you can, it'll be a check mark if you're within a certain amount. I overburned a little bit, so it's basically giving me, like, I could spend 20 meters per second to adjust the orbit back to what it was supposed to be. But since we're basically where we want to be, you can just hit X to clear it, and that maneuver node is gone. So yeah, now we are here in orbit. So the next order of business is we are going to want to reach the moon. So the way we're going to do that is a technique called a Hohmann transfer, I believe is the term, but and you'll see that in some of the tutorial materials if you look them up. But basically what we're going to do is we are going to make our orbit much more elliptical on one side to sort of reach the elevation that we need to encounter the moon. So as you can see here, you could do an 852.6 meter per second burn, and that would make our orbit basically hugely elliptical. And so what you're going to want to do is you want to create a maneuver, and you want to get the apoapsis of the planned orbit to be somewhere around the height of the moon. And at that point, now we're going to basically start looking for an encounter. You saw one there. So what we're going to do is basically you're going to drag around the dot on your orbit here, and we'll see if we get any encounters with the moon. There's one right there. So you'll see you get an encounter when the line color changes, and you'll see this would be an encounter with the moon where the new periapsis of our orbit with the moon would be right there. And then you'll see that we would basically fly right past and then go back into our elliptical orbit here. Now it looks like we maybe a little overshot what we actually needed here, so let's now shrink this maneuver and see if we can hit the moon a little closer. But once you've got any sort of encounter with the moon, you're in pretty good shape. So let's do that one. Really, any of these we could make work, but I'm going to do that. Wait, yeah. So just like fiddle around until you get one that looks like you want, but we'll do there. That looks pretty good. The reason that this one looks good is we get a periapsis that's relatively close, and we have a long enough encounter that we have some time to circularize our orbits. Because basically what our goal is going to be here, if you want to get a better look at your destination planet, you can actually focus the view on that, and you'll actually see your projected course. So here, when we do our maneuver here, our encounter will be right here, and you can actually add a second maneuver. And so the way that we want to do this, so right now, the periapsis of the orbit is 1 million kilometers, or sorry, 1 million meters. And we are going to want to bring that, the apoapsis of the orbit at that point, which is going to be way, way off in the distance here. If we burn retrograde, it will start to bring that new orbit into a circle. So basically, that will be our two maneuvers here. I usually like to only plan one maneuver at a time, but I just wanted to show you guys what that would look like. So I'll clear this maneuver, and then let's look at our first maneuver node. You can toggle through the maneuvers you've planned here with this little UI down here. So yeah, let's go ahead and perform that maneuver. That node isn't until 28 minutes from now, so I'm going to hit this little green arrow, which will speed time up to get us to where we want to go. Alright, so it moved us till we were 1 minute and 23 seconds out. Looks like this burn is going to be a 1 minute burn. This will actually use up the rest of the fuel in this stage, and then we'll change to the second stage. You can actually see on the little maneuver planner here, that white line is when our fuel will run out and we'll have to change stages. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set our SAS to the maneuver mode, so it's going to keep us pointed at that maneuver. And then it's a 1 minute 12 second burn, so we're going to basically want to start at half of that time, which will be 36 seconds out. So as soon as this hits 36 seconds, I'm going to fire off the engines by hitting C to get the throttle up. Alrighty. Here we go. So what we're going to be watching, if there's a stage change in the middle of your maneuver, you're going to look for that fuel on the left side there. When that starts to run out, we'll hit space to change to our next stage. seconds. 2, 1, 0. Cut. Alright. We nailed it pretty close there. So now what we want to do is we want to reopen the map and we want to make sure we still have our encounter with the moon, and we do. So at this point, one thing that we can do is we can now try to adjust our course a little bit before we get there. And what that's going to do for us is we can get this a little bit closer to where we want to be orbiting before we land. Now, we don't strictly have to do this. We have enough fuel here that we can just kind of brute force it and just basically burn retrograde here until we have an orbit around the moon. Easy enough. That's probably the easiest way to do this, but if you want to sort of fine-tune your approach, what you can do is you can kind of grab a point along your... Here, I'll change our focus back over here so you can see. Basically, like, when you're about halfway there, you can grab a point, and you can start tweaking your maneuver to try to basically adjust where you want things to land. And the nice thing about this is it's going to cost a very small amount of fuel for some pretty dramatic changes to your approach. So what we're going to do here is I'm just going to try to dial in a approach. So I'm going to focus my view over there again. And one nice thing about the maneuver editor is if you go over here, you can actually punch things in manually, like add a specific number, but you can also use this little graphical editor to click each sort of little node, and that will add some delta V in a direction. So let's adjust our orbit so we're coming in a little bit lower, because that'll save us the fuel of having to do that once we get there. So yeah, let's try to get the periapsis of our orbit as close as we can. So the moon doesn't have any atmosphere, so you don't have to worry about that, but if we want to get into sort of a lower orbit, that'll be easier for landing. So let's shoot for... let's go like... 100,000 meters. It's pretty good. Now, as you can see, we're going to kind of like come in over there, and we might want to adjust our orbit a little bit to make it more of like an equatorial orbit around the moon. So you can use basically your tools here to see... Oh, well, that adjusted our course to just hit the moon, so let's... Probably don't want to just run right into it. Okay, so 53,000 meters is a pretty good altitude there. So let's have that be our goal. And I'm just basically going to adjust this until it looks pretty flat with the moon. Cool. And now we've got this relatively cheap burn. It's only a 13-second burn, and that's going to get us in a much better spot. And then once we get there, again, we're going to do another retrograde burn to basically circle up our orbit there, and that's going to let us land nicely. Alrighty. But I'm going to delete maneuver 2 for now, go back to our maneuver 1. I'm going to warp us out there. You can see we hit our maneuver node over there. Comes in 1 minute. Controlling the ship here. Just to speed up time a little bit. Head over to that maneuver node mode. This one's a 13-second burn, so we're going to start burning when it's about 7 seconds out. Give it a second to turn it around. Missed it a little bit there because didn't give him enough time to turn it, but it's okay. This maneuver doesn't have to be super precise, so I'm just gonna... Cool. Alright, and then we make sure that this still is a situation we're happy with. I think it is. Yep, looks good. Alright. And then now not much to do other than wait for it to get there. So what I'm going to do, another nice feature, is if you want to just skip to a spot, you can click a point along the path and you can say warp here, and that will time warp. This one was 2 hours out. So we can see our little ship is getting ready to have an encounter with the moon. Alright, and now that we've done our time warp, we can do our last maneuver to circularize our orbit. So here, this is just going to be basically a hard burn in retrograde until we get that circular orbit. So what you can look at is the apoapsis and periapsis of the orbit, and we just want those to be as close to each other as possible. So let's get that down. And once you start to get down here, you can actually start just like clicking in the little maneuver editor here. Okay, so that gets them real close together. 51 and 55 is close enough. So it's going to be a 424 meter per second burn, 39 seconds. So let's warp to that time. Cool. Here we are at the moon. Tell it pointed at the maneuver. So 39 second burn, we're going to look to be about 20 seconds out from the node time. So let's speed it up a little bit. All right. Do our burn. 2, 1, go. So as you can see, orbit is coming in. The apoapsis of our orbit is eventually going to come around. All right. And you can see it circling up right there. All right, it's just 5 more seconds of burn. Okay. Great. All right. So now we've got our nice little circular orbit of the moon. Take a couple spins around, take a look at what you got. It's a pretty cool moon. Yeah, so now we're in the stable orbit of the moon. We're going to just keep orbiting around. So now, the next order of business is to disconnect our lander. Now, I usually like to do any sort of operations like this on the light side. It's a lot easier to see what's going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop this next stage. So the stage 3 is the fairing. We could have popped this earlier. It's a little bit of extra weight we didn't have to bring along. But we'll pop the fairing off. And now we have revealed our little moon lander. So the next stage after that is going to separate the lander off of the main pod here. So what we're going to want to do is make sure our throttle's at 0. Should have already been. But you don't want this thing rocketing off on you. But yeah, we're going to just hit space and they are going to separate. So now you have 2 different ships here. So you can actually switch controls of ships that are close to each other by hitting these square brackets. So these square brackets will toggle between ships that are within 2 kilometers of each other, so if you need to change controls. So this will take me back to controlling this ship, and then this will take me back controlling the lander. So we want to be controlling the lander now. We will extend our landing legs here, now that we've got the space to do it. So those are going to keep us pointed the right direction, and give us a nice soft landing once we get to the moon. So the way that we are going to land on the moon here is we're basically going to burn retrograde to cause our orbit to sort of just crash into the moon here. And we're going to do this on the light side so it'll be easier to see a good landing zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell pilot to point at retrograde. Basically, by burning retrograde, we're going to lower the opposite side of our orbit down towards the planet. So, as you can see, as we burn, eventually that line is going to intersect with the planet. And we're going to do a lot more burning, so you're not going to land exactly there because we're going to have to slow down a lot. So your landing zone will probably end up being somewhere before there. It basically is going to depend on how much you end up breaking. All right, so as you can see, our ship is already way off in the distance there. And we are going to start descending towards the moon. You're also going to want to keep it pointed in retrograde because as you go down, retrograde will always be pointing basically up away from the moon. So that's going to keep it an easy way for us to keep slowing ourselves down. Let's speed up time a little bit. It'll take a while to fall. I usually don't mess with it too much. This depends on how much force thrust your lander has, but this one we can probably start when our altitude is maybe like 30,000, and we'll start slowing down. So I'm going to go back down to speed here. And then we can start. Actually, you know what? Yeah. We're just going to go a little bit closer. We'll cut it pretty close. I'm actually going to not go until we're at 10 kilometers above the surface. One nice thing you can do here, you can hit F5 to quick save. I like to do that before you start hitting the ground because you don't have to revert the whole flight if things go wrong at this point. And the point where you hit the ground is often where things go bad. Okay. I'm going to start slowing this down a little bit here. Should give little pulses of the throttle. So you have your speed here. If you're in an orbit, it'll often... Okay, now we're close enough to the surface to change the surface. This is our speed relative to the surface. So we're going to want to hit the surface going probably no faster than 10 to 15 meters per second. Even that's pretty fast. But if we want our parts to survive, that's kind of where we want to be. So you can play this very safe or a little bit more cavalier, depending on how you feel about your piloting abilities here. But we're basically going to want to start slowing that speed down. And as you can see, our surface velocity is going to go down as we burn. So this is going to slow down our rate of falling. And as we're still burning retrograde, we're basically burning directly against our direction of travel here. Cool. So now that I've got it going pretty slow, we can just kind of glide in here. Give it a couple just pulses to keep that speed coming down. I'm going to use light throttle here. And you can just do little pulses to keep yourself falling slow. So keep this. See, I'm still speeding up a little bit. And there we go. We've landed on the moon. So now at this point, if you want to get feet on the moon, you can right-click on your hatch here. You've got your crew. Make sure that they have all the things they need. They'll by default have their little jetpack and backpack, so shouldn't have to change that. But on the little pilot window here, you can click EVA. That will get your little Kerbal out of the ship. And then to control the Kerbal here, you can kind of just spacebar to jump, WAS and D to walk around. And we did it. And you can right-click on the Kerbal. You can plant your flag. I'll ask you to add some commemorative label. did it. And admire your handiwork. And so let's say, oh, and you can actually see off in the distance up there, 74 kilometers out. That's our little moongoer ship orbiting there. So yeah, and we've got our Jebediah on the ground. Earth is off in the distance over there. And yeah, this is for the upskilling project. This is where we're going to stop. I'm going to include footage of getting back from the moon, just so you guys have it. But as far as the project, this is what you're aiming to get to. But yeah,